All right, I've got them finishing up. So, important things from yesterday. If you could only share 3, what would be the big 3 from yesterday? Try not to say the very last one, because obviously that's like the biggest one. Amaya, what's one?
The zero was kept backing up, and they ended up losing zero, and what's her name? I forgot her name. Ward. Yeah. Miss Wharton. She said it's time to paint her nails.
She did say it was time to get a fresh coat of nail polish on, didn't she? Okay, so that was the one that happened at the end. Now, why did Zero? They said they lost Zero. Where is Zero?
He ran away.
He ran away, but why did he run away? I'm not going to dig another hole, but before, what did he do before he ran? He knocked Mr. Pendanski out. Okay, Hayden?
It turns out Zero is related to Madam Zone.
Yes, that's something important. That would be a part of the big 3. So that's 2 big things. He sounds like he's related to Madame Zeroni. Then we also know that he's now on the run because he hit Mr. Pendanski and refuses to dig another hole. Is there anything else that might have been important that we learned yesterday? Nathan?
I still want those 7 holes dug.
Okay, yeah. So meaning that the other boys are going to have to pull in the work. But there is one more that's a little bit more significant than that. But I think Zero's experience kind of really stuck out to us. But they talked about something in the past yesterday. See if you remember that. There's one more big important thing. Do you know, Jordan? The treasure. What about it? Kissing Kate? Yes. And they were, and so now they came in with a gun. It was Linda Miller and Trout Walker, and so that's where we made the connection that who is probably related to Trout Walker? The warden, because Linda Miller was a redhead. So we're making those dots. So those were 3 big things. So you can see that we're reading kind of a lot each day because it is the end of the school year just about. And I have something that I'm wanting us to do that we need a week for. So we need to finish this by next week. So that's why we're reading big chunks, okay? Remember we talked about that on the 1st or 2nd day. Is this a fish?
No.
What is this?
It's a face.
It's supposed to be a face with the orange and what they're wearing at the camp. Yeah, we talked about all the different things that look like. Maddie? Not today, no. All right.
I was going to say the second last day you should watch holes.
The second last day. Maybe, I don't know. We'll see. Chapter 31. Stanley angrily dug his hole into the dirt. He was angry at everyone. Mr. Pendanski, the warden, Zigzag, X-Ray, and his no-good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. But mostly, he was angry at himself. He knew he never should have let Zero dig part of his hole for him. He still could have taught him to read. If Zero could dig all day and still have the strength to learn, then he should be able to dig all day and still have the strength to teach. What he should do, he thought, was go out after Zero. But he didn't. None of the others helped him dig Zero's hole, and he didn't expect them to. Zero had been helping him dig his hole. Now he had to dig Zero's. He remained out on the lake digging during the hottest part of the day, long after everyone else had gone in. He kept an eye out for Zero, but Zero didn't come back. It would have been easy to go after Zero. There was nobody to stop him. He kept thinking that's what he should do. Maybe they could climb to the top of Big Thumb, if it wasn't too far away. And if it really was the same place where his great-grandfather found refuge. And if, after 100 years or so, water was still there. It didn't seem likely, not when an entire lake had gone dry. And even if they did find refuge on Big Thumb, he thought they'd still have to come back here eventually. Then they'd both have to face the warden and her rattlesnake fingers. Instead, he came up with a better idea, although he didn't have it quite all figured out yet. He thought that maybe he could make a deal with the warden. He'd tell her where he really found the gold tube, if she wouldn't scratch Zero. He wasn't sure how he'd make this deal without getting himself in deeper trouble. She might just say, "Tell me where you found it, or I'll scratch you too." Plus, it would mean X-Ray would get in trouble too. She'd probably scratch him up as well. X-ray would be out to get him for the next 16 months. He dug his shovel into the dirt. By the next morning, Zero still hadn't returned. Stanley saw one of the counselors sitting guard by the water spigot outside the shower wall. Mr. Pendanski had 2 black eyes and a bandage over his nose. "I always knew he was stupid," Stanley heard him say. Stanley was required to dig only 1 hole the next day. As he dug, he kept a constant watch out for Zero, but he never saw him. Once again, he considered going out on the lake to look for him, but he began to realize that it was already too late. His only hope was that Zero had found God's thumb on his own. It wasn't impossible. His great-grandfather had found it. For some reason, his great-grandfather felt the urge to climb to the top of the mountain. Maybe Zero would feel that same urge. If it was the same mountain, if water was still there. He tried to convince himself it wasn't impossible. There had been a storm just a few days ago. Maybe Big Thumb was actually some kind of natural water tower that caught and stored the rain. It wasn't impossible. He returned to his tent to find the warden, Mr. Sir, and Mr. Pendanski all waiting on him. "Have you seen Zero?" the warden asked him. "No." "No sign of him at all?" "No." "Do you have any idea where he went?" "No." "Well, you know you're not doing him any favors if you're lying," said Mr. Sir. "He can't survive out there for more than a day or 2. "I don't know where he is." All 3 stared at Stanley as they were trying to figure out if he was telling the truth. Mr. Pendanski's face was so swollen he could barely open his eyes. They were just slits. "You sure he has no family?" the warden asked Mr. Pendanski. "Well, he's a ward of the state," Mr. Pendanski told her. "He was living on the streets when he was arrested." "Is there anyone who might ask questions? Some social worker who took an interest in him?" "Well, he had nobody," said Mr. Pendanski. "He was nobody." The warden thought a moment. "Okay, I want you to destroy all his records." Mr. Pendanski nodded. "He was never here," said the warden. Mr. Sir nodded. "Can you get into the state files from this computer?" she asked Mr. Pendanski. "I don't want anyone in the AG's office to know he was here." "Well, I don't think I can erase him completely from the state files," said Mr. Pendanski. "Too many cross-references. But I can make it so it would be very difficult for anyone to ever find a record of him. Like I said, though no one will ever look. No one cares about Hector Zeroni." "Good," said the warden. "I want you to summarize what just happened with your partner."
So basically, they're going to erase his phone.
Maddie, let him know how that makes you feel. Let him know how that makes you feel.
I guess we're making them become slaves. That's why they don't want
And Zero could
Okay. I was asking you to summarize. Who thinks that they could do that? Remember, when you summarize, you're not saying everything, only the most important pieces. Something should have stood out to you right then. What would you say? Hayden?
They're trying to erase Zero's identity and all his documents, so they're just trying to erase Zero as a fake.
Yeah, I'm not sure if his voice picked up, but he was like, erase Zero's identity. He's not even a person. So they're just going to let him die out there in the wasteland is what it sounds like. Are you okay with that?
No.
No. Brenda?
Is it illegal to like lose a child? Because they basically lost them.
Yes, it is. And so that's why they're saying we're going to make it as if he was never here, because they said he doesn't have even a caretaker for him. He was living on the streets. So they feel like that's what would make it easy for no one to ever know he was there, because they said no one would ask about him. What boy?
The boys, like,
Oh, yeah, the boys at camp would, but they're talking about, like, how Stanley has his parents at home, that if he didn't write them a letter after a week, do you think his parents would call and be like, hey, I haven't heard from Stanley, is he okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Does Zero have anybody he's writing to? No. So, yeah, the boys at this camp know, but no one outside of camp. Okay? All right, chapter 32. 2 days later, a new kid was assigned to Group D. His name was Brian, but X-Ray called him Twitch because he was always fidgeting. Twitch was assigned Zero's bed and Zero's crate. Vacancies don't last long at Camp Green Lake. Twitch had been arrested for stealing a car. He claimed he could break into a car, disconnect the alarm, and hotwire the engine, all in less than a minute. I never planned to, you know, steal one, he told them. But sometimes, you know, I'll be walking right past a nice car, parked in a deserted area, and, you know, I'll just start twitching. If you think I twitch now, you should see me when I'm around a car. The next thing I know, I'm behind the wheel. Stanley lay on his scratchy sheets. It occurred to him that his cot no longer smelled bad. He wondered if the smell had gone away, or if he had just gotten used to it. Well, hey, caveman, said Twitch, do you really have to get up at 4:30? Well, you get used to it, Stanley told him. It's the coolest part of the day. He tried not to think about Zero. It was too late. Either he'd made it to Big Thumb, or... What worried him the most, however, wasn't that it was too late. What worried him the most, what really ate at his insides, was the fear that it wasn't too late. What if Zero was still alive, crawling across the dirt, searching for water? He tried to force the image out of his mind. The next morning out on the lake, Stanley listened as Mr. Sir told Twitch the requirements for his hole. As wide and as deep as your shovel. Twitch fidgeted. His fingers drummed against the wooden shaft of his shovel, and his neck moved from side to side. You won't be twitching so much after digging all day, Mr. Sir told him. You won't have the strength to wiggle your pinky. He popped some sunflower seeds in his mouth, deftly chewed them, and spat out the shells. This isn't a Girl Scout camp. The water truck came shortly after sunrise. Stanley got in line behind Magnet ahead of Twitch. Well, what if it's not too late? He watched Mr. Sir fill X-Ray's canteen. The image of Zero crawling across the hot dirt remained in his head. But what could he do about it? Even if Zero was somehow alive after more than 4 days, how would Stanley ever find him? It would take days. He'd need a car. Or a pickup truck. A pickup truck with a tank of water in the back. Stanley wondered if Mr. Sir had left the keys in the ignition. He slowly backed away from the line, then circled over to the side of the truck. He looked through the window. The keys were there, dangling in the ignition. Stanley felt his fingers start to twitch. He took a deep breath to steady himself and tried to think clearly. He had never driven before. How hard could it be? This is really crazy, he told himself. Whatever he did, he knew he'd have to do it quickly, before Mr. Sir noticed. It's too late, he told himself. Zero couldn't have survived. But what if it isn't too late? He took another deep breath. Think about this, he told himself. There wasn't time to think. He flung open the door to the truck and climbed quickly inside. Well, hey! Shouted Mr. Sir. He turned the key and stepped on the gas pedal. The engine revved. The truck didn't move. He pressed the pedal to the floor. The engine roared, but the truck was motionless. Mr. Sir came running around the side of the truck, and the door was still open. Well, put it in Sir, said Twitch. The gear shift was on the floor next to the seat. Stanley pulled the lever back until the arrow pointed to the letter D for drive. The truck lurched forward. Stanley jerked back against the seat and tightly gripped the wheel as the truck accelerated. His foot was pressed to the floor. The truck went faster and faster across the dry lake bed. It bounced over a pile of dirt, and suddenly Stanley was slammed forward, and then instantly the airbag exploded in his face. He fell out of the open door onto the ground. He had driven straight into a hole. He lay on the dirt staring at the truck, which stuck lopsided into the ground. He sighed. He couldn't blame his no good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather this time. This time it was his own fault, 100%. He had probably just done the stupidest thing he had ever done in his short, miserable life. He managed to get to his feet. He was sore, but didn't think he had any broken bones. He glanced back at Mr. Sir, who remained where he was, staring at Stanley. He ran. His canteen was strapped around his neck. He banged against his chest as he ran, and every time it hit against him, he reminded himself that his canteen was empty, empty, empty.
No water for him.
Should he have thought that through?
Yes. He ran away. What retard? Jeez, you got some retard to go to school.
Yeah. You think he's gonna find him? All right. So
Somewhere dead.
he might. Now
He be dead and he gonna dead.
he could be. We're not quite sure what he'll find because he's just took off running too. Did Zero have water with him? No. Does Stanley have water with him? All right, we have a lot more to read today, okay? Chapter 33. He slowed to a walk. As far as he could tell, nobody was chasing him. He could hear voices coming from the back. Coming from back. It doesn't sound right. Hold on. He could hear voices coming from back by the truck. There we go. He could hear voices coming from back by the truck, but he couldn't make out the words. Occasionally, he'd hear the revving of the engine, but the truck wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. He headed in what he thought was the direction of Big Thumb. He couldn't see through the haze. Walking helped calm him down and allowed him to think clearly. He doubted he could make it to Big Thumb, and with no water in his canteen, he didn't want to risk his life on the hope that he'd find refuge there. He'd have to return to camp. He knew that, but he was in no hurry. It would be better to return later, after everyone had a chance to calm down. And as long as he'd come this far, he might as well look for Zero. He decided he would walk as long as he could, until he was too weak to go any further, and then he'd turn around and go back. He smiled and realized that wouldn't quite work. He would only go halfway as far as he thought he could go, so then he'd still have strength to return. Then he'd have to make a deal with the warden, tell her where he found Kate Barlow's lipstick tube, and beg for mercy. He was surprised by how far out of the holes extended. He continued even to see the camp compound anymore, but he still kept passing holes. Just when he thought he'd passed the last hole, he'd come across another cluster of them a little further away. And back at the compound, they had dug in a systematic order, row upon row, allowing space for the water truck. But out here, there was no system. It was as if every once in a while, in a fit of frustration, the warden would just pick a spot at random and say, "Well, what the heck? Dig here." It was like trying to guess the winning numbers in a lottery. Stanley found himself looking down into each hole he passed. He didn't admit to himself what he was looking for. After more than an hour had gone by, he thought he had surely seen the last hole. But then off to the left, he saw another cluster of them. He didn't actually see the holes. He saw the mounds of dirt that surrounded them. He stepped over the mounds and looked into the first hole. His heart stopped. Down at the bottom was a family of yellow-spotted lizards. Their large red eyes looked up at him. He leapt back over the mound and ran. He didn't know if they were chasing after him. He thought he might have seen one leap out of the hole. He ran until he couldn't run any further, and then he collapsed. They hadn't come after him. He sat there a while and caught his breath. As he got back to his feet, he thought that he noticed something on the ground, maybe 50 yards away. It didn't look like much, maybe just a big rock. But in a land of nothingness, anything little seemed unusual. He walked slowly toward it. The encounter with the lizards had made him very cautious. It turned out to be an empty bag of sunflower seeds. He wondered if it was the same one Magnet had stolen from Mr. Sir, although that didn't seem likely. He turned it inside out and found one seed stuck in the burlap. Lunch. Short chapter. Most of them are. Now, I could see out of the corner of my eye when I was reading one section how many of you were so afraid that 0 was at the bottom of that hole. So we know this is a serious thing, right?
At the bottom of the hole.
Ooh. When I was reading,
He in the hole, so
Andriana, were you listening?
I would, but how he get in the hole?
He wasn't. No, I said how many of you thought he was there. I'm gonna reread it. This part right here that said, well, let me find it. He stepped over the mounds and looked into the first hole. His heart stopped. When I read those words, his heart stopped. I was kind of like looking out the corner of my eye, and I could see all of you were like, oh, and that's where I knew you thought it was him. But it says down at the bottom was a family of what? Yellow spotted lizards, which is really scary because remember, they're deadly. Okay?
Wasn't it? Didn't that dude get bit by one? Whenever he died laughing?
Kate did.
Yeah.
And she died laughing. Yes. And they, very good small puzzle piece that you remembered, Madison. Yellow spotted lizards like sunflower seeds. There was a burlap sack of sunflower seeds there. So that must be why there was a lot there. Good. Okay. I'm going to go ahead to the next chapter because it is a good chunk today. Chapter 34. The sun was almost directly overhead. He figured he could walk no more than another hour, maybe 2, before he had to turn back. It seemed pointless. He could see there was nothing ahead of him, nothing but emptiness. He was hot, tired, hungry, and most of all, thirsty. Maybe he should just turn around now. Maybe he'd already gone halfway and didn't know it. Then, looking around, he saw a pool of water less than 100 yards away from where he was standing. He closed his eyes and opened them to make sure that he wasn't imagining it. The pool was still there. He hurried toward it. The pool hurried away from him, moving as he moved, stopping when he stopped. There wasn't any water. It was a mirage caused by the shimmering waves of heat rising off the dry ground. He kept walking. He still carried the empty sack of sunflower seeds. He didn't know if he might find something to put into it. After a while, he thought that he could make out the shape of the mountains through the haze. At first, he wasn't sure if this was another kind of mirage, but the farther he walked, the clearer they came into view. Almost straight ahead of him, he could see what looked like a fist with its thumb sticking up. He didn't know how far away it was. 5 miles? 50 miles? One thing was certain. It was more than halfway. He kept walking toward it, although he didn't know why. He knew he'd have to turn around before he got there, but every time he looked at it, it seemed to encourage him, giving him the thumbs up. As he continued walking, he became aware of a large object on the lake. He couldn't tell what it was, or even if it was natural or man-made. It looked like a little like a fallen tree, although it didn't seem like a tree would grow here. More than likely, it was a ridge of dirt of rocks. The object, whatever it was not on the way to Big Thumb, but off to the right. He tried to decide whether to go to it or continue toward Big Thumb, or maybe just go around it. There was no point in heading toward Big Thumb, he decided. He would never make it. For all he knew, it was like chasing the moon. But he could make it to that mysterious object. So he changed directions. He doubted it was anything, but the fact that there was something in the middle of all of the nothing made it hard for him to pass up. He decided to make the object his halfway point, and he hoped that he hadn't already gone too far. He laughed to himself when he saw what it was. It was a boat, or part of a boat anyway. It struck him as funny to see a boat in the middle of this dry and barren wasteland. But after all, he realized this was once a lake. The boat lay upside down, half buried in the dirt. Someone may have drowned here, he thought grimly, at the same spot where he could very well die of thirst. The name of the boat had been painted on the back. The upside-down red letters were peeled off and faded, but Stanley could still read the name. Mary Lou. On one side of the boat, there was a pile of dirt and then a tunnel leading down to below the boat. The tunnel, looked big enough for a good-sized animal to crawl through. He heard a noise. Something stirred under the boat. It was coming out. "Well, hey!" Stanley shouted, hoping to scare it back inside. His mouth was very dry, and it was hard to shout very loudly. "Hey," the thing answered weakly. Then a dark hand and an orange sleeve reached up out of the tunnel. Chapter 35. Zero's face looked like a jack-o'-lantern that had been left out too many days past Halloween, half rotten with sunken eyes and a drooping smile. "Is that water?" he asked. His voice was weak and raspy. His lips were so pale they were almost white, and his tongue seemed to flop around uselessly in his mouth as he spoke, as it kept getting in the way. "It's empty," said Stanley. He stared at Zero, not quite believing that he was real. "I tried to bring you the whole water truck, but," he smiled sheepishly, "I drove it into a hole. I can't believe you're—" "Me neither," said Zero. "Come on, we gotta get back to camp." Zero shook his head. "I'm not going back." "Well, you have to. We both have to." "You want some sploosh?" Zero asked. "What?" Zero shaded his eyes with his forearm. "Well, it's cooler under the boat," he said. Stanley watched Zero crawl back through his hole. It was a miracle that he was still alive, but Stanley knew he would have to get back to camp soon, even if he had to carry him. He crawled after him and was just about to squeeze his body through the hole. He never would have fit when he first came to Camp Green Lake. He'd lost a lot of weight. As he pulled himself through, his leg struck something sharp and hard. It was a shovel. For a second, Stanley wondered how it got there, but then he remembered that Zero had taken it after him after hitting Mr. Pendanski. It was cooler under the boat, which was half buried in the dirt. There was enough cracks and holes in the bottom of the boat, now the roof, to provide light and ventilation. He could see empty jars scattered about. Zero held a jar in his hand and grunted as he tried to unscrew the lid. "Well, what is it?" "Sploosh." His voice was strained as he worked on the jar. "That's what I call it. They were buried under the boat." He still couldn't get the lid off. "I found 16 jars. Here, hand me the shovel." Stanley didn't have a lot of room to move. He reached behind him, grabbed the wooden end of the shovel, and held it out for Zero, blade first. "Sometimes you just have to," Zero said. Then he hit the jar against the blade of the shovel, breaking the top of the jar clean off. He quickly brought the jar to his mouth and licked the sploosh of the jagged edges before it spilled. "Careful," Stanley warned. Zero picked up the cracked lid and licked the sploosh off that as well. Then he handed the broken jar to Stanley. "Drink some." Stanley held it in his hand and stared at it. He was afraid of the broken glass. He was also afraid of the sploosh. It looked like mud. Whatever it was, he realized it must have been in the boat when the boat sank. That meant it was probably over 100 years old. Who knew what kind of bacteria might be living in it? "Well, it's good," Zero said, encouraging him. He wondered if Zero knew what bacteria was. He raised the jar to his mouth and carefully took a sip. It was warm, bubbly, mushy nectar, sweet and tangy. It felt like heaven as it flowed down his mouth and down his parched throat. He thought it might have been some kind of fruit at some time. Maybe peaches. Zero smiled at him. "I told you it was good." Stanley didn't want to drink too much, but it was too good to resist. They passed the jar back and forth until it was empty. "Well, how many are left?" "None," said Zero. Stanley's mouth dropped. "Now I have to take you back," he said. "I'm not digging any more holes," said Zero. "Well, they won't make you dig," Stanley promised. "They'll probably send you to a hospital like Barfbag." "Barfbag stepped on a rattlesnake," said Zero. Stanley remembered how he'd almost done the same. "Why, I guess he didn't hear the rattle." "He did it on purpose," said Zero. "You think?" "He took off his shoe and sock first." Stanley shivered as he tried to imagine it. Why would he do that? Yeah, he wanted out of Camp Green Lake. So he literally let a rattlesnake bite him. Could have killed him. What's Marialuou? Asked Zero. What? Zero concentrated hard. Marialuou. I have no idea. I'll show you, said Zero. He crawled out from under the boat. Stanley followed. Back outside, he had to shield his eyes from the brightness. Zero walked around the back of the boat and pointed to the upside-down letters. Marialuou. Stanley smiled. Mary Lou. It's the name of the boat. Mary Lou, Zero repeated, studying the letters. I thought Y made the Y sound. It does, said Stanley, but not when it's at the end of a word. Sometimes Y is a vowel and sometimes it's a consonant. Zero suddenly groaned. He grabbed his stomach and bent over. Are you all right? Zero dropped to the ground. He lay on his side with his knees pulled up to his chest. He continued to groan. Stanley watched helplessly. He wondered if it was the sploosh. He looked back toward Camp Green Lake. At least he thought it was the direction of Camp Green Lake. He wasn't entirely sure. Zero stopped moaning, and his body slowly unbent. I'm taking you back, said Stanley. Zero managed to sit up. He took several deep breaths. Look, I got a plan so you won't get in trouble, Stanley assured him. Remember when I found the gold tube? Remember that I gave it to X-Ray and the warden went crazy, making us dig where she thought X-Ray had found it? Well, I think if I tell the warden where I really found it, I think she'll let us off. I'm not going back, said Zero. You've got nowhere else to go, said Stanley. Zero said nothing. You'll die out here, said Stanley. Then I'll die out here. Stanley didn't know what to do. He had come to rescue Zero and instead drank the last of his sploosh. He looked off into the distance. I want you to look at something. I just want you to look at the mountain up there. See the one that has something sticking up out of it? Yeah, I think. What does it look like to you? Does it look like anything? Zero said nothing. But as he studied the mountain, his right hand slowly formed into a fist. He raised his thumb, and his eyes went from the mountain to his hand, then back to the mountain. And that's where we'll stop today. So, turn and talk about what you think they're going to do now that they've noticed God's thumb.
They're probably going to
That's about the child Walker crash.
No, he drowned. He got shot in the head and down.
Y'all making me angry. Y'all irritating me horribly.
They both got shot.
That is what they were talking me about.
She's new to the feature. Probably. But who's watering it? And who's planting it?
I don't want to try.
Who's watering it?
Stop threatening me. I don't want to talk because I don't feel like talking.
You're talking right now.
Well, not to someone else. Well, I really don't want to talk to nothing. You run into a hole.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap them up because I've had something come up. So now I did want you to turn and talk about what you think could happen after this. And so what I need you to do as you're going to move to your seat, because normally we'd go to the restroom real quick, is you're going to do a 5-minute quick write. Your class didn't get to do that yesterday. Based on the information you've learned now, what you just turned and talked about, I want you to jot what you think is going to happen tomorrow now that they have noticed God's thumb and they still don't have water and they drank all the sploosh. So what are they going to do? Very quietly move to your seat and get out your reader's notebook. And then you guys think about what's going to happen as well.